Okay guys, I managed to hand wire my second keyboard, so may I present the Acrylic Tyaba. The Acrylic Tyaba is basically the same thing as the Tyaba I designed and built, but instead of having the switch plate made from 3D printed plastic, I have this made from acrylic sheets. So here's the story of how I built the Acrylic Tyaba. For my previous Tyaba video, I mentioned that one of the vendors suggested that I do a full acrylic build, so I took a whole night to make the thing. The Acrylic Tyaba was redesigned to have multiple layer sheets, which are 2 layers for the switch plate, 1 layer for the frame, and 1 layer for the bottom plate. Oh, and a few more sheets for the microcontroller cover and the tenting legs. I also designed the key to have holes in the frame so I can slide in brass spacers, hoping I don't have to rely on long screws to keep the key in place. The Pearl Micro sits in the middle and is raised a bit compared to the original Tyaba version. I also designed it to use hex nylon spacers for the controller cover so I don't short circuit the thing. Okay, so once I received the acrylic parts, the first thing to do was to paint the frame acrylic and bottom plate with frost paint. This is so that the RGB could be diffused better and would look nicer compared to having the clear acrylic. I could have just ordered frosted acrylic from the start, but since I wanted the word Tyaba to be visible, I figured I should just make it frosted myself. Alright, after drying off the paint, I tried to do a simulation to put in the brass spacers into the frame, but in the end I broke the frame in half. So I had to build this keyboard without a frame. Anyway, moving on, for this build I used Moondrop Tessence tactile switches because I like these weeb switches. Next was to loop diodes to the switches, solder them and make the rows. Then cut, strip and solder the wires to make the columns, then solder the wires to the controller. Wiring this thing took me about 3 to 4 hours to do. Compared to my first build, I had a lot of issues of wires not being soldered properly because the wires I was using were harder and wasn't as flexible. I also had to debug my keyboard because the keys were everywhere. Turns out I soldered the column pins in the wrong order, so I needed to reprogram my pins in QMK. So after getting the keys done, it's time to RGB the thing. This time I skipped having the LED strips on the top part of the key because I usually eat RGB from the front and the sides. I also cut a foam sheet to the shape of the Tyaba because I thought it would absorb some of the typing sound as well as hide the wires. Since I was using 7mm spacers, the foam mushes everything and causes more wires to disconnect, so I had to unscrew and screw the keyboard at least 5 times to resolder everything. The hard wires and the foam also pushes some of the switches up too, but I just had to push them back in. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm using KSA keycaps for this build. So after like a few days building this, the Acrylic Tyaba is complete. And here's a typing test. In terms of feel, the tactility is decent. It's not as noisy, I think. The keyboard height is just nice, and RGB is much more delicious compared to the previous build. However, I do think the keycaps aren't human friendly and the switches popping out isn't a good experience. Well, even with the challenges building this keyboard due to no tolerances for the holes, the harder 24 AWG wires being used, I'm happy with the slightly slimmer build, and overall it was a good experience building a hand-wired stacked acrylic keyboard. I'm just happy with how it turned out. Okay, that's all. Thanks for watching. ご視聴ありがとうございました。